next speaker for today is Rumtin Sepasspour. I hope I've said that right. He is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge and is currently leading a project on building the capability of the existential and global catastrophic risk research community at large. And during his talk today, Rumtin will tell us about the policy of existential and global catastrophic risk. Just as a side note, we again encourage you to submit your questions via the question chat box on Swapcard. You'll find this option on the right-hand side of your screen. Over to you, Rumtin.
Thank you. I'll share my screen and let's see how that goes. Go. How's that?
Yeah, works. Perfect.
Okay, great. Great to be here with you again after joining for the panel discussion yesterday, my last night here in Canberra, Australia. Today, as mentioned, I'll be covering the policy aspects of existential and global catastrophic risk. So I want to start way back. Since our solar system formed 4.6 billion years ago, there has remained remnant debris that has avoided colliding with the planets. There remains still over 16,000 such objects, mostly between Mars and Jupiter. And tracking these near-Earth objects has been an increasingly important activity ever since we discovered the real fate of the dinosaurs in the 1980s. In 1998, that activity took on a much greater effort and workload. The US Congress directed NASA to detect and categorize 90% of the potentially hazardous asteroids that had at least a 1 kilometer diameter. And this size of 1 kilometer equates roughly to the size that could cause a global catastrophe on the scale of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so NASA's Near-Earth program, Near-Earth Object Program was born. And in 2005, with that target achieved, Congress doubled the effort, directing the space agency now to find 90% of those near-Earth objects that were 140 meters wide or larger, effectively city-destroying objects. Not long after, a different congressional direction was made for another source of extraterrestrial concern. In 2007, while serving as the US Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid worked with 2 other senators, one Republican and one Democrat, to pass legislation that directed the Department of Defense to effectively investigate UFOs. It was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And after a few years, the program is rebranded and moved inside of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and it now calls itself the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force. The videos and photographs and reports that you may have seen in the last couple of years is a direct result of these programs. I start here, and I guess I bring you these 2 examples to show you 2 things really. One is how a little bit of policy can go a long way. NASA's asteroid detection program started out only with a few $1 million a year and didn't seem to arise from any direct political incentive, though it's unclear how the blockbuster movies of Deep Impact and Armageddon that same year potentially drove that effort. And now NASA's planetary defense budget is around $150 million a year. And the UFO detection effort started out with just $22 million in funding and continues its mission today. The other reason is just to highlight how narrow potentially our policy thinking is around existential risk. These 2 extremely low likelihood events have received a greater policy effort than many of the other existential risks that you've been hearing about over the course of the last day and the rest of today. And so let's think about changing that. If you're listening today, I guess hoping to get some transformational policy ideas, you might leave a little bit disappointed, I'm afraid. What I'm hoping to do in my discussion and my presentation is just to take a little bit of a step back and firstly provide some frameworks for how we can think about policy when it comes to global existential and catastrophic risks. And I do want to leave though with a sort of a message of action and practical next steps. So I hope to provide some options for the audience to think about when they're looking to act on policy. So let's first start with the frameworks of thinking. So it might be obvious to say, but I think it does bear repeating, that governments are a critical stakeholder when it comes to reducing existential and global catastrophic risks. This is especially true at the national level, though it can be easily expanded to the international level. It's the impact and the influence that governments have on potentially on our day-to-day lives, on the way businesses act, that shapes our contribution and our response to potentially some of these risks. Plus, governments are extremely well positioned, obviously, to act on these risks. They have the mandate, they have the capabilities, they have the resourcing, and of course the legislative power and punishment power to shape the way society responds. And in some cases, of course, national governments are a direct or indirect contributor to these risks. And when we think about nuclear weapons, or we think about other weapons of mass destruction, of course, it's not a purely government risk, but of course, they're a major contributor to that risk. And it's not to say that government policy should be the only route that we take towards shaping our future. Indeed, trying to influence policy effectively can come with pitfalls and traps and risks. There's uncertainty when it comes to what impact we might have on policy. It's hard to know, you might have a great policy advocacy campaign or engage policymakers, but you may never know exactly the direct result of that activity. And in a potentially worst case scenario, or one of the downsides, of course, could be that despite the best of intentions, you may not get the policy outcome you desire. Through design or implementation of the policy, there may be a failure in getting the outcome. It might lead to unintended consequences, for example. One of the other concerns here is, especially when it comes to existential risks, is around information or attention hazards, depending on how you want to define that. These are the risks that we face by publicizing or publicly discussing some of the risks that we face that might give more visibility to certain capabilities that might get into the hands of bad actors. We might politicize some of these risks by speaking about them. I mean, certain countries have not been able to make as much headway on climate change, not because there was not enough attention, but because almost there was so much attention that it potentially made those issues politicized enough that action couldn't be taken. And we should also be conscious of the reputational harms that might come from advocating certain positions, talking about certain issues that comes with policy engagement. I mean, I think the issues that we talk about obviously are very serious, and we take them seriously. But if not discussed in a positive, in a constructive way, it can be perceived as science fiction. It can be perceived as doomsaying. So being really careful about how we talk about and discuss these issues can have a really big impact on policy. So with that said, how should we speak to policymakers about existential and global catastrophic risks? And I want to talk through a couple of different lenses and frameworks for doing so. And here I've just represented a sort of a snapshot of all the risks that you've been discussing in the last day and today. There's many different ways you can slice the set of risks. This is just, my very quick interpretation or structure around it. There are environmental risks, technological risks, biological risks, weapons risks, and natural and cosmic risks. So that's one set of grouping, and some of those fall into multiple buckets at the same time. Another lens is the anthropogenic versus non-anthropogenic. So those that are human driven versus those that are not a result of human activity, or future and current risks. That might be another lens. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the way we think about these risks is, and it might be self-evident, is through a risk lens, and that's sort of a natural outcome of the way we see these issues and the way we think about these issues and the way we need to develop expertise around some of the issues. If you're an expert on or thinking about climate change, you're going to think about existential climate change risk. If you're an expert on nuclear weapons, etc. But it isn't the only way that we can think about risk, and especially from a policy perspective, there are potentially some other lenses that we might want to take to communicate and shape policy. I think it's important that we also consider that while there is value in speaking about and thinking about individual risks, there is value in thinking about the risks as a set. And this will become evident when we talk a little bit more about some of the policy perspectives. The reason it's important to think about them as a set is for a few reasons. The first is that we are focusing on the fat tail, what we'll call the fat tail of these normal risks. If we think about a distribution, the tail end of that, extreme end of that distribution is where we're focused on. And given the biases and the challenges when it comes to thinking about extremely low likelihood events or extremely uncertain events, it's important that we think about these as a collective set. Individual fields or individual policy domains may not necessarily think about those extremely unlikely events. They might be focused, and predominantly are, of course, focused on the very plausible aspects. It's also useful to think about these as a set from a research and policy perspective, because we can learn and apply lessons across these risks. We might find different ways to assess the risks, different methods to thinking about the risks, different and potentially policy lessons to be learned across the different risks. From a policy perspective as well, it's important to think about them as a set, because you can better compare and prioritize across the risks. One of the challenges, as I alluded to with the examples at the start, is that asteroids and extraterrestrial are extremely low likelihood events. And when we think about them as these risks as an entire set, we realize that there are certain risks with much more greater likelihood. And the anthropogenic risks are ones that have a much more likely, much greater likelihood this century, as an example. So it puts, for a policymaker, in perspective when we think about them as an entirety. And we can also better understand the interconnection between the risks. There are really important linkages to be made, for example, between AI and nuclear weapons and AI and synthetic biology, as an example. Or there may be perspectives we can draw from climate change events impacting geopolitical circumstances that drive conflict, as an example. So thinking about them holistically gives you a sense of how they might relate to each other. And finally, it's important to think about them holistically because you can bring a multidisciplinary perspective to many of these risks. Governments, at least effective ones, think about the greatest challenges from multiple perspectives and from a whole of government perspective, and bringing many different viewpoints, economic, philosophical, ethical, biological, whatever it is, all the different perspectives together can meet the challenge in a more effective way. So when it comes to actually, translating all of that into a bit more of a policy context, one of the sort of frameworks I like to think about is just effectively a generic risk management framework. Just because these risks are at a scale that of humanity level doesn't mean that we should treat them necessarily any differently from a process perspective than any other type of risk. And when it comes to risk management, there's some pretty well-established steps that one would take to manage a risk, whether you're a company, whether you're an individual, or whether you're a nation state, or whether you're civilization. The four very simple steps at the core of any risk management process, you look to understand the risks. So you go through processes to identify and assess the risks. You look at prevention. So what can you do to minimize the threat or the hazard that you're facing? 3, how do you prepare and plan for the risk event should it occur? And finally, if it were to occur, you need to respond and recover from that risk. Around that 4-step, very generic process, there are some other policy actions that you can take as well. There is governance arrangements around risk that you can put into place. There are communication and engagement you may need to do with stakeholders, industry, civil society, the media, citizens. Governments have an important role when it comes to communicating about any issue, but particularly risk. And of course, governments have to collaborate with each other and collaborate with other stakeholders when it comes to managing these risks. Now, when we think about, when I hear discussions about reducing existential and global catastrophic risk, the terminology I tend to find is very, not to be too harsh, but slightly loose. We talk about mitigating risk. We talk about reducing the risk. It's what I like about thinking about it this way is that it makes it really clear, what are you trying to actually achieve? When we're providing policy advice or trying to think of policy ideas and options to put to government, or when we're, when policymakers seek advice, we need to be really clear about, well, what are we actually asking them to do? A lot of the focus naturally is on the prevention bucket. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want these risks to occur. And so a lot of our focus from a research perspective and flowing onto our policy perspective is about what can we do to better prevent these risks. And that might be a very reasonable place to land, where that the emphasis is on that, on that section. But that doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't think about policy in other respects. I've been going through a recent exercise to identify or go through the literature on existential and global catastrophic risk and catalog the policy ideas across each of these buckets. And naturally, the understand and the prevent get a huge majority of the policy ideas. But there are some really important things we need to do to govern risk. There's really important things we need to do to prepare for the risks. Almost no one is thinking about what we do should a risk occur, and then we need to respond and recover. That's not to be unfair on the academics and the researchers. It still remains a relatively new field, but it goes to show that there are multiple perspectives that we can have and multiple parts of policy that we can look to shape. And the other lens, which I I alluded to in the panel discussion yesterday is a systems lens. The way I think about this is the different critical systems that either impact the risks or are impacted by the risks. These critical systems are ones that you could say society functions on. If you didn't have your health, if you didn't have food and water, if you didn't have energy, how could society will struggle to continue. And it's the same systems though that also drive many of these risks. Yesterday I showed the example of the food system being one that impacts naturally occurring pandemics. It also impacts biodiversity loss and climate change. But it's also a system that we need to really think about when it comes to a global catastrophe happening. Some of you may know about an organization called AllFed, whose entire purpose and focus is how do we make sure that the global populations are fed during a time of global catastrophe. The health system as well, obviously a driver of pandemics, but also one that is impacted by many of the risks. Should a risk occur, there will be a lot of death and destruction, and the health system needs to be able to be, it needs to be ready for that. And in the worst case, should a risk occur, these systems don't hold up in those scenarios. These are the same systems we will need to rebuild. How do we build our knowledge system? How do we build our governance? How do we build our economic systems? These are systems that we might need to rebuild in the aftermath. And so with this system lens, you can overlay this lens very directly with the risks themselves. And you can overlay it as well with the risk policy actions from the previous slide. And once you start overlaying them, you can see how many different variations we need to start thinking about. Like pick a risk, pick a policy action, and pick a system, and you can already get a sense of the very breaking down this problem set into different components. An issue I'm focused on at the moment is the geopolitical implications of these risks, particularly during a period of major power competition. So, I'm looking at that system being a driver of some of the risks that we face. It's very natural, as I said earlier, to think about the risks in their own domain. If you're an AI expert, you're thinking about AI risk, and if you're a climate change expert, you're thinking about those risks. I think it's also useful then to use some of these other frameworks to apply to that. And so when you're thinking about AI existential risk, and you're thinking about providing policy ideas or thinking about the policy perspectives of that, which part of it are you focused on? Are you focused on governance? Are you focused on prevention? Are you focused on preparation? Let's be clear about what we're seeking to do, and that way we can better frame these issues for a policymaker. So now that I've had a few ways to think about the problem. There's the risk lens, specific versus holistic. There's the risk by risk action. There's by systems. So there's multiple ways we can think about attacking this problem from a policy perspective. I don't want to just speak about frameworks though. I do want to talk about what can we do? What can we do as people in this audience? Obviously, policy is a multi-stakeholder process, and I'm sure there's people in the audience from many different groups. You might be a researcher or an expert. You might be a policymaker potentially. You might be leading an organization in the space. And I guess for each of you, I'm hoping, I guess, over the next few slides, provide some tangible next steps that you might want to take forward. For researchers, it's doing policy work, doing policy focused efforts, and engaging with policy is not typically part of your day-to-day. I mean, it might be something that many of you do, but obviously it's not the core part of the role. But that doesn't mean that researchers can't play a really important role in contributing to policy in your respective fields and in your respective countries. I feel like there's a few simple steps that or actions that researchers can take if they want to make some of their work more policy relevant. There's, if you're struggling to think about, how do I even start? Where do I even begin to make my work policy relevant? It might just be as simple as a high-level brainstorm on the policy implications of your work. Why does my work matter for policy? Why does policy matter for my work? Just doing some of that thinking might reveal some opportunities there. I mean, in the most developed case, potentially even converting one of your research projects into a policy memo for a policy customer, and getting, an academic report is very different to a policy report, and it'll provide an opportunity to communicate your findings and communicate your research in a very different context and for a very different audience. I would, suggest thinking about the risk policy actions and the systems when you're doing that work. If you're an organizational leader in this space, there's actions that you can take to better establish a foundation for more policy work. One of the pieces of work I've been engaging with over the past 6 months is looking at how the field of researchers and organizations in this space can better engage with policy. And one of the critical gaps in a general sense is having a foundation on which members of this community, researchers, etc., can do more policy work. I think making it really clear that policy impact is part of your organization's goals is really important. I think developing an interface with policy is a really simple but powerful way to bridge the gap between the researchers and the policy world. They can help play that translation role. You may even want to do a little bit of a self-assessment on your organization's policy skills and capabilities. There might be some in this audience who sit at the interface of science and policy, whether you're in the communication space, whether you are sitting side by side with researchers and doing public engagement of some kind. You have an important role, obviously, when it comes to policy, and a few high-value activities that I've seen being done by the science policy interface in the community include really about playing as effectively as possible that bridge. And it's really understanding both what policy customers need and what researchers can provide. Sometimes it's obviously as simple as connecting the two, but a lot of the work goes into translating that academic finding and research, collecting and packaging up the research and presenting it in a digestible and clear way, establishing networks between academics, with policymakers, and really about finding strategic opportunities to engage policy. When it comes to shaping policy on these sorts of issues, we may not have, or we don't have, the luxury of waiting for it to happen for us to act. I think what people realize in the aftermath of COVID-19 is that it wasn't that we didn't know about the risk. Of course, it was a very well understood risk, at least by those in the scientific community, and even beyond. Indeed, those countries that had most recently experienced a pandemic an epidemic, had the learnings and the processes and the policies still there from the 5 or 10 years ago when they encountered it. So finding those strategic opportunities to shape policy is a really important area, and it's not about waiting for the risk to happen. It's about finding other policy windows and other opportunities for change. One of the reasons I like the critical systems view is that you are attacking the problem while you're not attacking the problem or the risk directly. You are developing a foundation on which more long-lasting policy can occur. So you may want to attack AI policy, or sorry, I would say climate change policy through environmental and climate change actions, but attacking it from an economic perspective or attacking it from a food and water perspective might be not only just as effective, but potentially more tractable and more possible. So finding those strategic opportunities and different ways of attacking the problem is really important. And finally, I do want to put a few sort of broad policy ideas for people to consider if there are any policymakers in the room. Just thinking about the govern and the understand steps in that risk management sort of process. There's some quick wins that we can, and low-hanging fruit we can take away. We can think about setting a national risk policy and strategy. Many countries have national security strategies, but governments need to think a bit more broadly about what risk actually means. Security is just one set of risks, but there are obviously non-malicious and non-traditional threats that are potentially very dangerous, as the current situation obviously shows. So having a national risk strategy or national risk policy setting can provide the overarching governance on which we do risk work, including existential and global catastrophic risk work. We can think about creating dedicated roles and organizational structures to support this. A country risk officer is an idea that's been floating around a little bit in the background over the past few years, but is getting a little bit more traction. A minister level individual whose job it is to oversee the national risk policy and the implementation of that, and owns the risk at that level. A banking institution has a chief risk officer. It's a very standard and common practice because they understand that their role is to manage operational and financial risk. It's not that much different with a government. Their job, among many things, but one of their primary jobs is to manage the risk to the country, and without having a dedicated person, it's going to be difficult to do that. You can think about dedicating budgets towards risk management. We can't, how many trillions have been spent in economic packages and in the health system as a result of COVID-19. A fraction of that could have been spent beforehand to position us well. So if that budget is allocated and dedicated beforehand, specifically for risk efforts, it's a way to minimize the effect, particularly the economic and fiscal effect of that afterwards. Many countries have a national risk assessment process that can be either improved or expanded to include extreme events, including existential risks. These national risk assessment processes have not held up particularly well in the past couple of years due to poor and faulty methodology. So countries need to reflect on governments need to reflect on how they do national risk assessment processes going forward. And relatedly, there can be more effort around futures analysis. Some countries, including Singapore and the UK, have central units that lead futures and strategic foresight activities. These can be powerful tools if used well. It's not it doesn't solve all your problems, but if used well and if applied properly, they can be really powerful tools to thinking about a long-term future. It doesn't have to be just risk-based futures, but it can be, and it can be for domestic and social issues, just as it can be for existential risks. But having these capabilities positions governments to think long-term and builds a culture and norm around thinking in long-term. So I'll leave it there. I do want to leave enough time for questions. I do hope that was useful and interesting. I wanted to keep it a bit high level just for, and allow questions to be a bit more specific. I really think it's important. The reason I've focused on the frameworks primarily is because I think it's really important that we take that step back and think about the problem in these different ways. Policymakers will appreciate and potentially be more receptive to these other frameworks. Attacking it at a risk lens may not always be the most effective, and a critical systems view or a risk management view might provide some really powerful avenues for policy change. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rumtin. Some really concrete and concise advice there for policymakers. There are a couple of questions, and I will dive right into them. So going back to the beginning of when you spoke about how well-positioned governments may be to think about and to act upon mitigating X risks or GCRs in general. But at the same time, they may not be well equipped to do so. They might be well positioned, but not necessarily well equipped. What kind of challenges do you encounter in thinking about how well governments are at present ready to handle existential risks?
So I guess, I pause on it because it's a big question, a tough question, and it does depend, I guess, in some respects to, I guess, what we mean by ready in some ways. That even if I think one of the struggles that governments have now, or have always had, but is that but particularly now, is the speed with which the risks are arising, the scale with which they are, the uncertainty and complexity that the risks are that present. Those are very challenging environments for governments to operate, for anyone to operate in, but governments, particularly given their size, given their scale, can struggle with operating in that environment. The agility that's required to be positioned and capable and effective in terms of responding to these risks is going to be really difficult. And it is it does mean that, to an extent, that governments might not always be the best source of the or solution provider for these risks, and might actually need to step out of the way potentially. But there might also be policies in place that don't allow them to step out of the way, or political incentives not to step out of the way. So it's for each of the, potentially with each of the risks, but also potentially each of the systems, there might be very different ways the government should approach it. One, common thread that comes through in being, for countries to be best positioned for these risks, is at least for preparing for them, is to decentralize and disaggregate these systems to lower levels. When resilience is achieved at an individual or a local community or a local level, that can position countries to be really much more effective in responding to the risks. So it's in that sense governments not having to be effective, because it's the local resilience that really achieves the goal. But that local resilience and community level resilience is something that governments need to facilitate and need to drive. Food, energy, water, these sorts of information and technology, these sorts of systems are very centralized in some respects. And so if we don't manage to decentralize them and disaggregate them, we might struggle. I hope that answers the question, but there's a few thoughts in there.
No, absolutely. I mean, we still, I feel, are in the process of figuring out what would be the best way to handle. Would decentralization be the best way forward, or should centralization still remain our primary focus, and where to go from there? Relatedly, do you think that policymakers themselves, not governments per se, but the policymakers, even know enough about these risks to even start making plans? And do they even have access to the relevant expertise that they might need for effective planning and then the execution part of it per se?
I guess yes and no, in the sense that there's plenty of, governments have, particularly the bigger ones, and let's just sort of be slightly biased in the sense of towards sort of Western Europe, the UK, US, Australia, sort of developed country, OECD sort of countries. They have huge resources, they have huge capability, scientific capability, research capability. The amount of effort that goes into in defense establishments around long-term planning and capability development, and it's huge, right? At the same time, they are missing certain framing. So it's not that necessarily that they don't have some of the capability or understanding there, it's that they might not have the right framing that's required to think about these risks. And so some of those framings and frameworks and processes, like a national risk assessment process, for example, can, in a sense, provide some of that framing for them and be an avenue to provide them the understanding that they need. I definitely think that governments need to improve their understanding of these risks, but it's not for lack of people or lack of resources. It's that those people and resources may not be aiming in the right direction. So I think things like a national risk assessment process, foresight and futures capability, advanced research programs, stronger engagement with scientific communities and academic communities, all of those things are really productive and important ways to instill and improve the understanding of some of these risks. Because it's definitely not for lack of money and resources.
So that makes me wonder, do you think that certain experts in certain fields, for example, AI developers, who are maybe perhaps better positioned, if not well positioned, to think about the risks that their own technology creates for society at large, and also to think about safety, for example, AI safety, should they themselves then be allowed to present their own policies, or should we nevertheless still leave it up to the government to set up policy around these issues? Or should there be some sort of coordination between the two?
I think if you leave government to it, they're going to come up with a policy either way, right? So it just might not be the right one or the best one. And so, because, let's say in that example, AI practitioners might be best placed to understand what the right policies are, or understand what would work and what would not, it's all the more reason for them to engage with policymakers, because policymakers are going to, they have other pressures, political pressures and incentives. And we're already seeing this, say, for AI, there's due to geopolitical competition and economic competition, and the transformative opportunities and and challenges from AI, many countries around the world are already implementing solutions around AI. Sorry, not solutions, policies and legislation around AI. And so it requires, it makes it all the more important for experts, academics, researchers, practitioners to engage in the policy process so that they can share their advice, they can share their expertise, and frame the issue in the best possible way that both clarifies the opportunities and the risks. So yeah, overall, the policy is still the domain of government at the end of the day. It doesn't mean that, of course, that doesn't mean that businesses and corporates and researchers shouldn't develop their own corporate policy, academic policy around these issues. But when it comes to public policy, government policy, that's still going to be the domain of government. But by its nature, it's not going to be designed by people who are naturally sort of experts in it, or the practitioners, and all the more reason for those individuals to be engaged in the policy process.
Right. And speaking of the policy process itself, you mentioned certain risks that are associated with engaging with policies, or sometimes the lack of engagement itself, such as a policy fails, or there are certain impacts under conditions of uncertainty that we can't account for. And then, as you mentioned, there might be politicization of the issue because there's too much polarization. If we were to say compare and rank these risks in order of magnitude as to which we should tackle first, which one of these risks do you think should be our primary focus to make policy making and the process itself as effective as possible?
My sense is that each of the different risks or each of the different systems will face each of those sort of challenges differently. For example, synthetic biology and AI may be we should be a bit more alert to the information and attention hazard of those risks. So that's a concern that might arise with something like nuclear weapons. It's a generally, at least within nuclear powers, it's a bipartisan issue. So you're not really risking politicizing the issue really that much. It's less of an issue there, and it might be more an issue of policy uncertainty, and given the massive establishment that those programs have, it's hard to know how to change it and shape it from the outside. So that's going to be the challenge. So it does really depend on each of the individual risks. Having said that, I think at the end of the day, the policy is a complex system, and the outside world in which policy engages is a complex system. All that's to say that it's very difficult to identify the unintended consequences and the second order effects of of the sorts of policies that are being put into place. And so that's the one that's a really challenging one, and one we need to be really alive to, is that the sort of research community that's studying these risks is still trying to grapple with the risk. There's a lot of uncertainty in even the risks themselves, let alone the uncertainty in the policy aspects of those risks. And so it's something that it should be on the top of people's minds, is when they're thinking about the policy perspectives and coming up with policy ideas, it's important to understand the implementation aspect of that. It's easy enough to come up with a policy idea on paper and just sort of put it down and say, this is what governments should do. But when it comes to implementing and actioning that idea, what else could go wrong? Why could this lead to unintended consequences? That's the challenge. And I'll use that as just another plug for why I do like the systems-based view, because there are potentially some really low-hanging fruit when it comes to fixing the food system, fixing the health system, fixing our economic system as an example. there are some really important and meaningful measures we can take in some of those systems that will have positive effects, not just on the risks, but on everything. Whereas if we try and attack the problem at a risk level, it might be more unclear, especially the highly uncertain and future risks. It might be much more difficult. So, that's to say is that it's important to think about some of those challenges, attack the problem from different perspectives, or at least think about the problem from different frameworks and perspectives, and find where those opportunities, where the benefits clearly outweigh the risks.
Right, that's extremely helpful. There's, I think, a related question that Matt Boyd, who just presented before you, has. So how would you go about communicating the implicit assumptions that are often embedded in governmental risk assessment processes to society? And how would we listen to the critique of these implicit assumptions? Also because sometimes these risk impact matrices, they hide a lot of assumptions and they're not always made explicit.
It's a really great question, and it's actually something I've been thinking about very recently, because it's completely right that risk matrices are hugely problematic for multiple reasons, but particularly this issue that they hide what's underneath. And there are challenges in communicating these risks challenging communicating any type of risk in the public domain. The perspective I come to this is there are one way of potentially getting around this is, instead of trying to communicate what the risks are and saying, here's a likelihood impact matrix, here are the risks, just trust us, which is sort of, if you've ever seen the UK National Risk Register or some of the other sort of public documentation, it's just a set of risks and there's not really much explanation, is to identify what are the drivers of the risks, and pulling out the common drivers across multiple risks. That way we get a little bit away from a risk-based lens and a little bit into the more driver trend lens, which I think serves a few goals. One is that you therefore are providing some of that underpinning insight and assumptions. It also makes it potentially could make it less confronting and scary, because you're not talking about really bad outcomes that are unlikely. You're talking about, here are trends and issues we are facing right now that, if they continue, will contribute to risk down the line. So by sort of focusing more on the drivers that underpin the risks, which, if you have, let's just say, 30 risks on your risk register, and each of those risks has a number of drivers, it shouldn't be part of the analytical work should be pulling together, okay, what are the key drivers and trends that underpin multiple risks? And that way we do, again, sort of get away from the risks a little bit. We also get away from the likelihood impact matrix, which has a bunch of problems, and we focus a bit more on the underpinning and the foundational elements of those risks. And also those drivers will feel more actionable. When you just sort of say, hey, solar storm, that's a risk on our risk matrix. I don't know what to do with that information. But if you say, one of the drivers is, centralized telecommunication systems, and therefore we need to diversify, whatever the case might be, it becomes a bit more tangible, it becomes a bit more identifiable and a little less scary as well. So hopefully that answers the question, but one that I'm still thinking about and trying to come up with solutions to. So I'll be keen to chat with Matt more about that afterwards.
No, thank you. Just relatedly, so at least from my understanding, one reason why we continue using these risk matrices is because it helps us really simplify a lot of information and not end up in a situation where we have too much information that we can't make sense of anymore. So perhaps something of a moderate approach where we can still sort of utilize the benefits of a risk matrix that helps us sort of visualize the risk with few variables, few factors in a way that helps simplification, but at the same time doesn't lose out too much information or hides all these assumptions, as Matt pointed out. So can you perceive of such a moderate approach, or are you familiar with such an approach that's already in use?
The challenge that we face when we try and sort of adjust the likelihood impact matrix is that it has tended to confuse the issue a bit more potentially. For example, incorporating the idea of uncertainty into a matrix by putting a risk on a spectrum or putting a circle around it to identify the so that uncertain, it just ends up creating more confusion. I get the value, like the value of a likelihood impact matrix. You know, it's powerful because it's a process to assess the risks as soon as you get a likelihood and impact. So it's a model to assess the risks. It's a model to communicate the risks because people can sort of see it on an individual plane. And it's also a model to prioritize the risks because you can say, okay, these ones fall into the red zone. These are the ones we should focus on. So, you know, you have this one model that helps you go through the journey. But, you know, it falls into traps at each of those steps. You know, how do you assess likelihood is an issue. How do you incorporate uncertainty is an issue. How do you deal with risks on a that could sort of be on a spectrum? There are so many issues with it that I would actually sort of suggest avoiding it altogether and finding different ways of communicating it. And that's why I sort of lean towards maybe just focusing more on the drivers and less on the risks themselves. That way you can avoid a matrix sort of issue and just say, you know, we've identified what our top risks are. Here are the 5, 10, whatever number of drivers that are underpinning the risks, and that's what our focus is going to be on. And so, yeah, my gut feel, I don't have a neat answer to it yet. I still working this out, but my gut says that there might not be a moderate approach, and maybe we just need to come with a new way of representing risk and risk drivers. The other, the sort of other perspective, just to add as well onto Matt's question, is I think governments need to trust more in their citizens. That there's this sense that if we give them too much information, it's going to cause panic, it's going to cause concern, it's unnecessary, and I don't buy into that. I think that it's a process, but it's one we need to engage, governments need to engage citizens on, because you can't build local and individual resilience if people don't understand what risk they're facing, and if they're not going to understand it if we don't communicate about it publicly. Sweden, a number of years ago, sent out a pamphlet to all households called something like "Preparing for War or Crisis," something like that. And you put it in very stark terms, make sure you have, this many cans of gas, and, make sure you have food and blah, blah, blah. Like it was a very matter of fact communication device. And no one, in Sweden was like, why is the government telling, this is ridiculous, they're scaring me. Because they have that culture there. They understand resilience and threat from multiple perspectives. And so having that culture of risk and resilience has built them towards that. In many sort of Western societies, I feel like governments don't take that approach. They take a very sort of secretive official approach. We'll do the risk assessment, we'll identify what the top ones are, and maybe if you deserve it, we will tell you what they are, instead of a much more a greater conversation with citizens about the risks, and you build from there. So I think the other way of sort of overcoming this issue of explaining the assumptions and thinking behind the risk is being much more upfront and discussing it. You might not give it all away in the first time you discuss it, but over time you can build that into the public discourse, and over time it'll be a much more stronger and well considered and mature public discussion about many of these risks.
Definitely, and definitely a lot more work that needs to be done in that direction. I notice we've kind of reached the end of this hour. We would love to keep the conversation going, but perhaps just to end on one last question on behalf of students who may be interested in having an existential risk career, and probably it's their dream position to work at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. Do you perhaps have any tips on how a student can steer their career in that direction?
I think my tip would be it's going to sound sort of very obvious, but get involved however small you can. If it's doing a small research paper, volunteering for one of the existential or GCR shops, doing your own private research, whatever the case might be, helping out how you can, but just starting small, and it builds from there. You know, today is my final, I have officially resigned from my public service job, and today was my final day at work. And so I'm, you know, venturing out on this career of existential risk. It started small. It started with just one, you know, myself volunteering effectively for CISA and providing a different perspective to the issue, a policy perspective in this case. And it started from there, and it just snowballs from there. So if there's anything I can suggest, it's, you know, don't, like, obviously if you can apply and if you can put yourself in that position, great. But the most important thing is to start small and build from there.
Thank you so much. It was lovely speaking with you, Rumtin, and good luck with your future endeavor at CSIR. And we look forward to reading about more of your work.